Nobody in Johnny Carson's studio expected the night to become uncomfortable. It was supposed to be another entertaining evening. The lights were bright, the cameras were rolling, the audience was laughing, and millions of people were watching from their living rooms. Then Bruce Lee walked onto the stage, calm, quiet, almost impossibly composed. Beside him sat David Carradine. Two famous names, two very different men. And neither of them knew that one sentence would change the entire atmosphere of the studio. Johnny Carson smiled toward Bruce. "So, Bruce, people are fascinated by you." The audience laughed softly. Carson continued, "They hear all these stories about your speed, your training, your martial arts. How much of it is real?" Bruce Lee smiled. He didn't boast. He didn't exaggerate. He simply leaned toward the microphone. "Most people think martial arts are about defeating another person." He paused. "They are not." Carson raised an eyebrow. Bruce continued, "They are about defeating the weakness inside yourself." The audience became quieter. Bruce spoke about discipline, about timing, about balance, about controlling fear instead of allowing fear to control you. He explained that a fighter could possess enormous strength and still lose because he lacked awareness. He could be fast and still be defeated because he moved without purpose. He could know 100 techniques and still fail because he didn't understand the moment. Carson listened carefully. But across the couch, David Carradine was smiling. At first, it was subtle, almost invisible. Bruce continued, "A real martial artist doesn't need to prove that he is dangerous." Carradine gave a quiet laugh. Bruce stopped. He looked toward him. Carradine shrugged. "Sorry." Bruce smiled politely. Carson glanced at Carradine. "Something funny." Carradine leaned back. "It's just—" He looked at Bruce. "You make it sound like philosophy." A few people laughed. Bruce didn't. Carradine continued, "I mean, Bruce." He smiled. "At the end of the day, it's fighting." Bruce remained silent. Carradine tilted his head. "Isn't it?" Bruce looked at him for several seconds, then answered, "No." The audience became quiet. Carradine smiled. "No." Bruce shook his head. "Not if you understand it." Carradine laughed. "That's exactly what I mean." Carson looked between them. Carradine continued, "You take this very seriously." Bruce said nothing. Carradine leaned forward. "When the cameras are on, everybody can look like a fighter." A few audience members laughed. Carradine looked directly at Bruce. "You're an actor." The laughter became louder. Bruce didn't move, not even slightly. His expression remained completely calm. Carson smiled awkwardly. "David?" But Carradine wasn't finished. "I'm just saying." He shrugged. "Hollywood can make almost anything look real." The audience laughed again. Bruce lowered his eyes. For a moment, it seemed as though he would simply let it go. Then he slowly looked back at Carradine. His voice was almost a whisper. So he paused. "You think what I do is only acting?" Carradine answered immediately. "I think you're a very talented actor." Bruce nodded. "Interesting." Carson leaned forward. The audience sensed something changing. Bruce continued, "You have seen me on television." Carradine nodded. "You have seen me in films." Another nod. "But you have never seen me move." Carradine smiled. "I've seen enough." Bruce stared at him. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Have you?" Silent. Carradine's smile faded slightly. Bruce placed his microphone down slowly, carefully. Then he stood. The audience gasped. Carson's eyes widened. "Bruce!" Bruce turned toward Carson. His voice remained completely calm. No one is going to get hurt. Then he looked back at Carradine. Stand up. 2 words. Nothing more. Carradine stared at him. For the first time that evening, he didn't immediately have an answer. The audience waited. Carson looked toward Carradine. Carradine slowly stood. The room erupted with nervous laughter and applause. But Bruce didn't smile. He stepped away from the couch. The stage suddenly felt enormous. Then somehow, too small, Bruce raised his hands, not like a man preparing for a street fight. His hands were relaxed. His shoulders were loose. His breathing was steady. Carradine watched him carefully. Bruce said, "Don't attack." Carradine raised an eyebrow. "Wait, because you're going to learn something first." Bruce took 1 step. Carradine watched. Nothing happened. Then Bruce moved. For a fraction of a second, he seemed to disappear from where he had been standing. A gasp swept through the audience. Bruce stopped. Carradine's eyes widened. Bruce lowered his hand. That was speed. Carradine stared at him. Bruce shook his head. "No," he smiled faintly. "That was control." Carradine didn't laugh anymore. Bruce moved again, a tiny shift of the foot, a change in distance, a sudden stop. Carradine instinctively moved backward. The audience reacted. Bruce stopped. He looked at Carradine's feet, then at his eyes. Balance. Another movement. Carradine tried to follow. Bruce was already somewhere else. Not far, just enough. Always just outside the distance Carradine expected. Bruce stopped again. Timing. The studio was silent. No jokes, no laughter, no applause. Everyone was watching the same thing. A man who wasn't trying to look powerful. He simply was. Carradine breathed out slowly. Bruce lowered his hands. "You see?" Carradine nodded slightly, but Bruce wasn't satisfied. "You thought fighting was about hitting harder." He took a step closer. "It isn't another step. It's about knowing when not to hit." Carradine looked at him. Bruce continued, "You thought speed was moving fast." He shook his head. "Speed is arriving before the other person realizes you've moved." The audience erupted in applause. Bruce didn't react. He turned toward Carson. Carson stared at him. "Bruce!" Bruce smiled. Carson shook his head. "I've got nothing." The audience laughed, but Carradine was still standing there, quiet, thinking. Then he finally spoke. "You're good." Bruce smiled. "Good." Carradine nodded. "Very good." Bruce looked at him, then said, "You still don't understand." Carradine frowned. "What don't I understand?" Bruce stepped closer, and this time his voice became softer. "You think tonight was about proving I'm better than you." Carradine said nothing. Bruce continued. "It wasn't." He paused. "It was about showing you how dangerous it is." Another pause. "To judge something you've never experienced." The words hit harder than any punch could have. Carradine looked down, then slowly nodded. "I misjudged you." Bruce smiled. "That's all." For a moment, it seemed the tension was finally gone. The audience began applauding. Carson smiled. The cameras pulled back. The confrontation was over. Or so everyone thought. Because just as Bruce turned to walk back toward his seat, Carradine spoke again. "Bruce!" Bruce stopped. He turned around. Carradine looked at him. There was no laughter in his voice now. No arrogance, no mockery, only curiosity. I want to ask you something. Bruce waited. Carradine took a breath. You showed me speed. Bruce said nothing. You showed me timing. Still nothing. You showed me control. Bruce nodded. Carradine looked directly into his eyes. But there's one thing I still don't understand. Bruce waited. Carradine's next words made Johnny Carson sit forward. Could you do all of that? He paused, without ever touching me. The studio went silent. Bruce stared at him. For several seconds, he didn't answer. Then Bruce smiled. Not a mocking smile. Not a victorious smile. A knowing smile. And he quietly said, Yes. Carradine blinked. Bruce stepped forward. But if I show you, he paused. You may never look at fighting the same way again. The cameras moved closer. Carson stopped smiling. The audience leaned forward. And David Carradine suddenly realized something. He had asked for another demonstration. But he had no idea what Bruce Lee was about to show him, because the next few seconds would become the moment nobody in that studio would ever forget. The studio was completely silent. Not the comfortable silence that sometimes followed a joke. Not the brief pause between questions. This was different. Everyone was waiting for Bruce Lee to move. David Carradine stood directly in front of him. A few feet separated them. No weapons, no stage props, no choreography. Just two men standing beneath the television lights. Johnny Carson watched from his desk. The cameras were locked onto Bruce, and Bruce Lee wasn't moving. Carradine waited. Nothing. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. Bruce simply stood there. Carradine finally smiled. So Bruce didn't answer. He only looked at him. Carradine shifted his weight. Bruce's eyes followed the movement. Nothing else. Then Bruce quietly said, Don't move. Carradine frowned. I'm standing still. Bruce nodded. Exactly. A few people in the audience laughed nervously. Bruce turned toward Carson. This is what people misunderstand. Carson leaned forward. Bruce continued. They think martial arts begins when you attack. He looked back at Carradine. It begins before that. Carradine watched him carefully. Bruce raised one hand. Your eyes. Carradine blinked. What about them? They tell me what you're thinking. Carradine laughed. You can read my eyes. Bruce smiled. No. A pause. I can read your body. The laughter disappeared. Bruce took one slow step to the side. Carradine's eyes followed him. Bruce stopped. Your shoulders moved. Carradine looked down. Bruce continued. You were preparing to turn. Carradine looked surprised. Bruce moved again. Carradine instinctively adjusted his feet. Bruce stopped. Your right foot. Carradine looked at it. Bruce smiled. You moved it before you realized you were going to. Johnny Carson slowly stood from behind his desk. The audience was fascinated. Bruce wasn't throwing punches. He wasn't even touching Carradine. And yet, Carradine was reacting to every movement. Bruce stepped forward. Carradine stepped backward. Bruce stopped. Carradine stopped. Bruce moved left. Carradine followed. Bruce moved right. Carradine followed again. Then Bruce suddenly froze. Carradine froze too. Bruce smiled. You're following me. Carradine laughed. What am I supposed to do? Bruce answered. Nothing. Carradine frowned. Bruce lowered his hands. That's the hardest part. The audience applauded, but Bruce didn't acknowledge it. He looked at Carradine. Most people are afraid of being attacked. He paused, but the better fighter understands something else. Carradine waited. The real battle. Bruce pointed lightly toward the space between them. Is deciding what happens next. Carradine stared at him. Bruce took another step, then another. Carradine remained still. Bruce stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Bruce suddenly moved his hand toward Carradine's shoulder. Carradine flinched, but Bruce stopped his hand inches away. He never touched him. The audience gasped. Bruce lowered his hand. Carradine stared at the space between them. Bruce said, "That," he paused, "is control." Carson looked stunned. "That was close." Bruce smiled. "It was supposed to be." The audience laughed. Carradine shook his head. "You knew I would move." Bruce nodded. "You told me." Carradine frowned. "When?" Bruce pointed toward his face. "Your eyes." Carradine laughed. "You're kidding." Bruce shook his head. "No." Then Bruce demonstrated again. He raised his hand slowly. Carradine watched. Bruce stopped. Carradine didn't move. Bruce smiled. "Better." Then he moved again. Carradine remained still. Bruce stopped. "Better." Then Bruce suddenly shifted his body. Carradine reacted. Bruce immediately stopped. "There." Carradine looked frustrated. "What? You were ready?" Carradine stared at him. Bruce continued. "You can't hide anticipation." Carson walked a few steps closer. "Are you saying you can tell when someone is about to attack?" Bruce answered, "Not always." Carson smiled. "That's reassuring." The audience laughed. Bruce smiled too. Then his expression became serious again. "I don't need to know exactly what they will do." Carson looked curious. "Then what do you need?" Bruce looked at Carradine. "Only one thing." "What?" "Where they are." The room became quiet again. Bruce continued. "If I know where you are." He shifted his foot. "I know what I can do." Then, suddenly, Bruce moved. It happened so quickly that the camera almost seemed to miss it. One moment, he was standing several feet away. The next moment, he was directly beside Carradine. His hand stopped inches from Carradine's chest. No contact, no strike, just perfect positioning. Carradine's eyes widened. The audience erupted. Carson turned toward the camera. "Did everybody see that?" The studio exploded with applause. Bruce stepped away. Carradine slowly exhaled. He looked at Bruce, then at Carson, then back at Bruce. "How did you do that?" Bruce smiled. "I didn't do anything." Carradine laughed. "You moved." Bruce nodded. "Exactly." The audience laughed. Carradine shook his head. "No, seriously." Bruce's expression softened. "You were looking at my hands." Carradine looked confused. Bruce pointed toward his feet. "You should have watched my feet." Carradine looked down. Bruce continued. "The hands show you what someone wants you to see." He tapped his foot lightly against the floor. "The feet tell you where they're going." Carson stared at him. Then he looked at Carradine. "I think David just got a private lesson." The audience laughed. Carradine smiled. But then something unexpected happened. Carradine took a breath. He looked at Bruce. And this time, there was genuine respect in his voice. "Can I try?" Bruce nodded. "Of course." Carradine stepped forward. Bruce moved back. Carradine followed. Bruce stopped. Carradine stopped. Bruce smiled. "Good." Carradine tried again. This time he moved faster. Bruce moved faster too. Carradine shifted left. Bruce was already there. Carradine shifted right. Bruce was already waiting. The audience began reacting louder and louder. Carradine suddenly lunged forward. Bruce moved sideways. Carradine's hand passed through empty air. Bruce didn't touch him. He simply stepped away. Carradine turned. Bruce was standing behind him. Carradine froze. Bruce said quietly, "Too much." Carradine laughed. "What? You tried to win." Bruce stepped around him. "You stopped learning." The laughter disappeared. Carradine stared at him. Bruce continued, "The moment you decided you had to beat me." He paused. "You stopped seeing me." That sentence hit differently. Carradine looked down. Carson looked at Bruce. Bruce wasn't talking about fighting anymore. He was talking about life, about ego, about the human need to prove ourselves. Bruce looked toward the audience, a person who is always trying to prove he is stronger. He paused, is often afraid that someone will discover he isn't. The studio became completely silent. Even Carradine seemed affected by the words. Bruce turned toward him. "You don't need to prove anything." Carradine nodded slowly. Then he smiled. "You're making this sound like therapy." The audience laughed. Bruce laughed too, and for the first time that night, the tension completely disappeared. Carradine extended his hand. Bruce shook it. Carradine said, "I was wrong about you." Bruce nodded. "Thank you." Carson smiled. "Well, I think we've reached the happy ending." The audience applauded. Bruce returned toward his seat. Carradine followed. The cameras began pulling back. The demonstration was over. The confrontation was finished. The audience had seen Bruce Lee move. They had seen his speed, his timing, his control. But they had not seen what Carson was about to ask. Because as Bruce sat down, Johnny Carson looked at him. Then he looked at Carradine. Then he smiled. "Bruce." Bruce turned. Carson said, "There's something I want to know." Bruce waited. Carson leaned forward. "You've spent all this time showing David how not to get hit." The audience laughed. Carson continued. "But what happens?" He paused. "When you actually decide to hit someone." The audience reacted immediately. Carradine looked at Bruce. Bruce didn't smile for the first time that night. His expression became completely serious. He looked toward Carson, then toward the audience, then back at Carradine, and quietly said, "That a long pause is a different lesson." The studio fell silent. Carson asked, "Would you show us?" Bruce didn't answer immediately. He looked at Carradine. Carradine nodded. Bruce slowly stood again. The audience erupted, but this time Bruce didn't raise his hands. He walked toward the center of the stage. Then he pointed toward a small object sitting near the edge of the set. Carson looked at it. The audience looked at it. Carradine looked at it. Bruce said, "Bring me that." A production assistant hurried over. He placed the object in Bruce's hand. Bruce held it quietly. Then he looked at Carson. "You want to see what power really is?" Carson nodded. Bruce looked toward the audience. Then, "Don't watch my hands." He paused. "Watch what happens." His eyes shifted toward the object. "Before I move, the cameras zoomed in." Carradine stepped closer. Carson stood. The entire studio leaned forward, and Bruce Lee prepared to demonstrate something that would make the previous display of speed look almost meaningless. Because this time, he wasn't going to show them how fast he could move. He was going to show them how little movement he actually needed. And what happened next would leave David Carradine staring at Bruce Lee without saying a single word. The studio had gone completely silent. Bruce Lee stood beneath the bright television lights holding the small object in his hand. Johnny Carson was watching. David Carradine was watching. The audience was watching. Millions of people were watching from home, and nobody knew exactly what Bruce Lee was about to do. Bruce looked at Carson. "You wanted to see power." Carson nodded. Bruce looked down at the object in his hand. Then he said something that confused everyone. Power is not what you think. He placed the object on a nearby table. Carradine watched carefully. Bruce stepped away from it. No dramatic pose, no preparation, nothing. Carson looked at him. That's it. Bruce smiled. That's the beginning. The audience laughed. Bruce walked back toward the object. He stood several feet away. Then he became completely still. His shoulders relaxed. His arms hung naturally. His breathing slowed. Carradine watched his feet, then his hands, then his face. Nothing. Bruce wasn't moving. Carson waited. The audience waited. Then Bruce whispered, "Watch." His hand moved. Just once. A tiny motion. The object shifted. It moved across the surface of the table. The audience gasped. Bruce didn't celebrate. He simply looked at Carradine. Carradine stepped closer. "How did you do that?" Bruce smiled. "Less force." Carradine shook his head. "I don't understand." Bruce pointed toward the object. "You were expecting something big." He paused. "But real control doesn't need to look big." Carson nodded slowly. Bruce continued. "When people want to look powerful," he raised his hand, "they make everything bigger." He lowered it. Their movements. He took one step. Their voice, he became still. Their ego. The audience became quiet again. Bruce looked toward Carradine. "But the stronger you become." He paused. "The less you need to prove." Carradine stared at him. Those words were no longer about martial arts. They were about him, about what had happened earlier, about the moment he had laughed, about the moment he had called Bruce Lee an actor. Bruce could have humiliated him. He could have embarrassed him in front of Carson and millions of viewers. Instead, he had taught him. Carradine slowly nodded. "I understand now." Bruce smiled. "No." Carradine looked confused. Bruce continued. "You understand the technique." He pointed toward his chest. "You haven't understood the lesson yet." Carradine waited. Bruce walked closer. "The lesson is not how to beat another man." He paused. "The lesson is how to control yourself when your pride tells you that you have something to prove." Carradine lowered his eyes. The audience was completely silent. Bruce continued, "Tonight." He looked at Carradine. "You thought you needed to prove something." Carradine smiled faintly. "Yes," Bruce nodded. "So did I." Carradine looked surprised. Bruce continued, "That is why I stood up." A pause. "Not because I was angry, not because I wanted to hurt you, but because sometimes—" He looked toward the audience. "The only way to understand something is to see it." Carson slowly nodded. Then Carradine stepped forward. He looked directly into Bruce's eyes. "I owe you an apology." Bruce said nothing. Carradine continued, "When I called you an actor." He paused. "I thought I was making a joke." Bruce smiled. "I know, but I was wrong." Bruce nodded. Carradine extended his hand. Bruce took it. The audience erupted in applause. For several seconds, neither man said anything. Then Carson looked toward the audience. "Welding." The crowd laughed. "I suppose that's one way to end an argument." Bruce smiled. Carradine laughed, but Carson wasn't finished. He looked toward Bruce. "You know what fascinates me?" Bruce waited. "You could have embarrassed David tonight." Bruce shook his head. "Why would I?" Carson smiled. "Because he challenged you." Bruce looked toward Carradine, then answered. "That's exactly why." Carson frowned. "Why?" Bruce took a breath. "Because If someone insults you. He paused, and you lose control. Another pause. Then they control you. The studio became silent again. Bruce continued. If someone challenges you. He looked at Carradine, and you remained calm. Then he smiled. You are still free. The audience exploded into applause. Carson looked genuinely impressed. Carradine nodded slowly, and in that moment, something had changed. The man who had mocked Bruce Lee earlier was now standing beside him. Not defeated, not humiliated, but humbled. And Bruce Lee had accomplished something much harder than knocking someone down. He had made someone rethink what strength actually meant. The cameras slowly moved closer. Bruce sat down. Carradine returned to his seat. Carson looked at both men. Then he smiled. I have a feeling. He paused. This is going to be one of those nights people remember. The audience applauded again. Bruce smiled. But the story didn't end there because after the cameras stopped rolling, something happened that the television audience never saw. The studio lights began shutting down. The audience started leaving. The crew began removing equipment. Johnny Carson walked backstage. Bruce Lee remained near the stage. Carradine approached him. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Carradine said, Bruce. Bruce turned. Carradine smiled. I meant what I said. Bruce nodded. What part? Carradine laughed. All of it? Then he looked serious. I really did underestimate you. Bruce smiled. Most people do. Carradine raised an eyebrow. Doesn't that bother you? Bruce shook his head. No. Why not? Bruce looked toward the empty studio. Because I know who I am. Carradine remained silent. Bruce continued. If I need everyone else to believe it. He paused. Then I don't believe it myself. Carradine slowly nodded. That sentence stayed with him. For a moment, they simply stood there. Then Carradine extended his hand again. This time, Bruce didn't immediately shake it. He looked at Carradine, then smiled and said, Next time. Carradine waited. Don't challenge what you haven't taken the time to understand. Carradine laughed. I won't. Bruce finally shook his hand, and that was it. No knockout, no winner's belt, no defeated opponent, no dramatic victory, just two men standing beneath fatting studio lights. One had made a mistake. The other had chosen patience instead of anger. And somehow, that made the moment more powerful than any fight could have been. Years later, people might remember Bruce Lee for his speed, for his films, for his martial arts, for the legendary image he left behind. But the most important lesson was never about how quickly he could move. It was about how completely he could control himself. Because Bruce Lee understood something that most people spend their entire lives learning. Strength is not always the ability to destroy. Sometimes strength is the ability to walk away. Sometimes strength is remaining calm when someone tries to provoke you. And sometimes the strongest answer isn't a punch. It's proof. David Carradine had walked onto Johnny Carson's stage believing Bruce Lee was simply another Hollywood actor. He left seeing something different. Not a myth, not a superhero, not a man who needed applause, but a disciplined human being who didn't need to shout to command attention. Bruce Lee never had to tell the room he was dangerous. The room discovered it on its own. And that may have been the most powerful lesson of all, because when the lights went out that night, the applause eventually stopped. The cameras eventually turned off. The audience eventually went home. But one thing remained: respect. Not the kind demanded by fear, The kind earned through control. And as Bruce Lee disappeared behind the studio curtains, Johnny Carson watched him leave. Then Carson quietly turned toward Carradine. He smiled. "You know," Carradine looked at him. Carson nodded toward the stage. "I think you just got the best martial arts lesson television has ever seen." Carradine laughed, then looked toward the empty stage and quietly answered, "I think I did." The camera would never capture that final moment. The audience would never hear those words. But if there was one sentence that could summarize the entire night, it would be this: Bruce Lee didn't stand up to prove that he was stronger than David Carradine. He stood up to prove that real strength doesn't need to prove itself. And perhaps that is why, even after the laughter disappeared, even after the cameras stopped, and even after the lights went dark, the lesson remained, because Bruce Lee didn't win a fight that night. He won something far harder to earn. He earned respect without demanding it. And he taught a room full of people that the most dangerous man isn't always the one who throws the first punch. Sometimes it's the man who has the power to throw it and chooses not to. That was Bruce Lee, and that was the lesson David Carradine never forgot.